Hey everyone, I'm Dan from JazzComposersPresent.com, an online space where composers, musicians, and listeners come together to celebrate the music we love. I'm joined today by John Yao, trombonist, composer, band leader, Assistant Professor of Trombone at Berklee College of Music, and Adjunct Professor of Music at Molloy College. John is here to show us how to construct a blues using a 3-note cell.
Thanks so much for having me back, Dan. It's great to be back here. I'm here to talk about how to build a blues melody using 3-note cells and these 3 melodic tools of octave displacement, reordering of pitches, and transposition. And today's mini lesson is going to be follow-up on my first mini lesson where I explained these 3 techniques in detail and gave some simple ideas for building melodic material with 3 and 4 note groups from a 12-tone row. So if you're not familiar with that or you need a quick refresh, I would just recommend you go back and watch mini lesson 1 before going on. So today I'm going to demonstrate these 3 techniques, and I wrote 3 blues melodies, starting kind of simple and getting more complex. So before we start, we have to get a row and start to pick some notes from the row. So here's the row that we're going to work with today, and this is what it sounds like. Keep in mind that not all rows are alike, and some parts of the row are more interesting than others. So it's really up to you to decide which group of notes you like and which you would like to pursue. For me, I tend to look for interesting intervals and shapes that are not symmetrical. So you can see in this slide here that there's some 3 and 4 note groups from our row that we're gonna call A, B, and C. So if you can show that slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Some trichords or tetrachords have harmonic implications, such as a chord or notes from a scale. So let's take a closer look at these 3 groups. We're starting with A. If you rearrange these notes for group A, and you put them closer together, you'll see that it's basically a C7 chord. So that kind of gives us that sound if we're looking for that. For group B, if I take a 3rd note and I move it an octave higher, now it's 1, 2, 3 of an F sharp major scale. And group C has a little more interesting shape to it with the major 7 up and minor 3rd down. And this gives us 2 intervals that are not symmetrical, like they're in group B, which has the 2 whole steps, or group A, which has stacked thirds, giving us the C7. So today I'm going to write I have these 3 blues examples using group C and a B flat blues. So let's jump into the first example. If we can show that first slide, that would be great. Okay, excellent, thank you. So our first blues example uses mostly transposition and reordering of notes, some use of octave displacement, but mostly those first 2. So right off the bat, I use transposition to stay inside the harmony. So I took my trichord of E, flat, D, and B, and I put it down a half step so it could be more diatonic to the B flat blues progression. And you'll see at the end of the first 2 phrases, I used reordering of notes to build a phrase which later returns slightly different to finish out the melody. So you can see that this example, some of our trichord notes function diatonically and others function as alterations. So, one example of that is the very first measure, beat 3, I have a D flat on B flat 7, which just gives us that sharp 9 sound. Just a quick side note, there's different schools of thought about using accidentals at the octave. And when you start using octave displacement, this becomes something you have to be aware of or, consider. So some people believe that the accidental carries over the octave. Some people don't. It's hard to tell. I've found it better, just to be super obvious and use cautionary accidentals at the octave. So there's really no gray area because you'll get a lot of people asking you questions about that. Let's move on to our second example. If we can bring up example 2, thanks. This second blues example makes more use of these 3 tools. Here I kept the trichord at the original pitch level from the row, which results in a sounds a little further outside of the harmony of B flat blues, not so diatonic. And you'll see in the first phrase here that I use transposition differently in measure 2 than I did in example 1. So instead of transposing the 3 notes to the same scale degrees of E flat 7, like I did in the first example, in this one, I transposed the trichord down a whole step and found a nice ending note A on E flat 7, giving me the sharp 11, which is a nice colorful sound. And you'll see throughout the example, I use transposition to kind of find some more colorful notes. And in the third phrase, I use octave displacement to extend the line and create an interesting shape with some wide intervals. And at the very, very end of the melody, I reorder the notes to make my last phrase sound more final. So you can see here that I use each of these 3 tools a little more than I did in the first example, and things got a little more interesting. Let's move on to example number 3. In this example, I used each of the 3 tools, but in a much more complex manner. In the first phrase, you'll see that I'm more active with the line, less repetitive than the previous examples. And you'll hear at the end of the first phrase that I transpose the trichord down in whole steps, which results in a lot more non-harmonic tones and a very unique sound. This technique is also called planing. In the second and third phrase, you'll also see that I used octave displacement and reordered the notes to make some really wide intervals and shapes. So let's take a listen to example number 3. So overall, example number 3 is a more developed, more complex melody, that's more chromatic and goes, further outside the harmony of B flat blues. Another side note to keep in mind, that these wide intervals can be easier to execute for some instruments than others. So for example, a phrase like I had in the last 2 bars of example 3 will be easier to play for a saxophone player versus a brass player. So it all obviously compare hinges on the tempo, which is another consideration you have to have. But at this tempo, it'll work for both sax and brass. But obviously, as you get faster, wider intervals, can be harder to play accurately for brass instruments. So it's just something to consider as you're writing, using octave displacement and exploring some of these tools. So as you can see from these 3 blues examples, these tools allow you to create melodies that range from simple to a really complex line. And I didn't even explore in our examples today, which you could do on your own, combining several 3 and 4 note group cells from the row and using these 3 tools, together with those different groups of 3 and 4 notes to create an even more complex line. So how much or how little you decide to use and combine them will probably determine how tonal or atonal your melody will sound. But it really all depends on how much you want to explore and how far you want to go down the rabbit hole. But I would definitely encourage you to use these concepts to break out of your comfort zone. Push the limits of what your ears will accept. Don't play it safe all the time. And you'll see that the more you experiment with these tools, the more your ears will start to open up to these sounds and shapes that aren't diatonic to the chord progression or aren't something that you would even necessarily play or come up with on your own. And you should be looking for notes that don't work. And I know there's someone really famous who said this, but looking for the wrong notes, if you will. So you'll see there's infinite possibilities, and you can easily get kind of overwhelmed and bogged down with that. Don't sweat that. Just have fun, and just explore and see what you come up with. So you'll see that these transposition, reordering the notes, octave displacement of 3 and 4 note groups. That can be used in a diatonic or a non-functional manner to create a melody of your choice. It all depends on your ear, your musical taste. So I hope this gave you some ideas of things to explore, and I look forward to hearing what you come up with. Thanks so much for watching today.
Thanks for watching today's mini lesson. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Drop any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos down below. To watch our full-length events and participate in live Q&As with our presenting artists, head to jazzcomposerspresent.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.